Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I hope you're all doing so well. Welcome back to another true crime and makeup episode. Today we are covering the case of Richard Speck. This guy's a monster, aren't they all? But monstrous. This man slaughtered 8 student nurses in one night. Now, because he murdered 8 student nurses in one night, he is known as one of the most heinous, vicious and horrific mass murderers in American criminal history. And yeah, I get it. Before we get into the case, please make sure that you are subscribed to my channel. I post every single Wednesday and Sunday. It would mean the world if you can engage in the video in some way. A like, comment, share, whatever you can do would mean the world to me, just to help push my videos out, get me into the algorithm, because YouTube does not like some of the words that I continue to use. Also, I just want to say I'm really sorry if my voice kind of dips in and out in this video, and if my energy is a bit lower at times. I don't feel very well, but I was gonna film this tomorrow, and then I realised if I wait till tomorrow I might feel worse and might not be able to film at all. So I just figured, battle through it, Anna. Get the video filmed so you can get it up on Sunday. Don't forget to leave your case suggestions in the comments down below, or send them over to my email. I am working through my emails. If you've sent me one, I will be replying in the next few days, or I should maybe have already replied, but if not, it's coming. But without any further rambling and any further ado, let's get into the horrific case of Richard Speck. So, Richard Benjamin Speck, he was born on the 6th of December 1941 in Kirkwood, Illinois. Now, he was the 7th of 8 children. 8 children. I'll never get over 8 children. I think it was the norm back then, but it's definitely less heard of now. But he was the 7th of 8 children to Benjamin Franklin Speck and also Mary Margaret Carbach. Shortly after he was born, the family ended up moving to Monmouth, Illinois. It's spelled Monmouth, but I feel like it's Monmouth. I'm not sure. But they moved there, and his mother, Mary Margaret, she was a teetotaler, so no drink, no alcohol whatsoever, really clean cut, very religious. And his father worked as a packer at Western Stonemere. Now, he had previously worked as a farmer and a logger, but somehow he ended up in this job. Now, very tragically, when Speck was just 6 years old, his father would die of a heart attack at just the age of 53. Now, obviously, this completely shocked the family, and Speck was heartbroken because he was really close with his father in a way that he wasn't with any other members of his family. So it's like the person that's closest to him has just been ripped away. Now, just a few years after the death of Speck's father, his mother did remarry to a man by the name of Carl August Rudolph Lindbergh, and this man was very, very different from Speck's father. So Carl Lindbergh, he was a travelling salesman, and he had a 25-year criminal record. It was extensive, and his record ranged from forgery to several countless DUIs. And Carol was a very, very hardened drinker. He drank constantly. I think he was pretty much an alcoholic. And for Speck to see this was really strange, because his father was the complete opposite. His father was his clean-cut idol who didn't participate in anything like that at all. And when Carl would drink, he would get very abusive, not only towards Speck's mother, but also to the children. Specifically Speck, he would be very verbally abusive to him. Now, as if Speck hasn't already faced enough tragedy in his life, and bearing in mind he is just a young boy at this point, in 1952, his older brother Robert, he would die in a car accident at the age of 23. Yet again, this is going to take a further toll on Speck. He's just losing loved ones constantly, and now he has this strange man in his life who's almost trying to take the place of his dad, who is just an awful man to him. So at this point in the case, we are going to talk about Speck's time in Dallas between 1951 and 1966. In 1951, after just 1 year in Santo, Speck would move with his mother, Lindbergh, and also his sister, Carolyn, to East Dallas. The family, they would bounce from house to house. They lived in a lot of very poor neighbourhoods within the city, and it was at this point that I would say that Speck really started to loathe his stepfather. Throughout school, Richard Speck, he was quite a poor student. And I don't mean poor as in just, financially poor. I just mean a poor student. Like, he had like a few behavioural issues. He wouldn't wear his glasses that he really needed to wear. So he was basically going in there kind of blind. He wouldn't really talk much in class because he had really bad anxiety, and he also had this really intense fear of people staring at him, which of course stems from anxiety, but I think it obviously goes deeper than just that. Now, Speck did actually have to repeat 8th grade, and he wound up dropping out of his 2nd semester in his 1st year of high school, so not really got much education to him. Now, sadly, by this point in time, Speck had actually picked up his stepfather's drinking habits. He was drinking and drunk almost every single day. And he would also be arrested for the first time in 1955 when he was just 13 years old for trespassing, and this would be followed by dozens of other arrests. An important part of the story that you need to remember is Speck once got a tattoo that said "Born to Raise Hell." And that he did. But this tattoo is going to be pivotal to this case, so bear that tattoo in mind. Now, it did seem like this tattoo was kind of like an ethic that Speck lived by, because he would be arrested 41 times before the age of 24. Which is insane. From 1960 to 1963, Speck would work as a labourer for a 7-Up bottling company. And then in October of 1961, he met a young girl by the name of Shirley Malone. She was only 15 at the time that her and Speck met, and they began dating, and just 3 weeks later, Shirley would be pregnant with his baby. Now, the couple did go on to marry in 1962. He had moved in with Speck's sister Carolyn and her husband, and also Speck's mother, who had split from Limburg. Now, Speck's daughter would be born on the 15th of July 1962, and at the time that Shirley had given birth to his daughter, he was serving a 22-day jail sentence for disturbing the peace when drunk. Yep. And then, in July of 1963, Speck would be sentenced to 3 years in prison after being convicted of forgery, robbery. He had actually forged and cashed one of his co-workers' $44 checks. 44? Was that what we were working for back then? $44? Absolutely not. Now, he had also robbed a grocery store for beer, cigarettes, and $3. He's aiming high. Robbing them for $3. Wow, what a loot. After 16 months of his imprisonment, he was paroled. Now, this sweet taste of freedom that Speck had longed for lasted a whole week. He just couldn't stop. The crimes, crime was his passion. That's the only way I can describe it. And he would be arrested yet again for attacking a woman in the parking lot of her building that she stayed in. He had a 17-inch carving knife and threatened to kill her. Luckily, somehow this woman was able to flee the scene and scream for help. And when she did scream out for help, this meant that Speck ran away. Now, within minutes, the police arrived and they were able to apprehend Speck. He did not get very far. Now, for this horrific crime, he only got a 16-month sentence. And, in error, he would be released after 6 months. Who made this error? I need to speak to you. In January of 1966, Shirley Malone, Speck's wife, she would file for divorce from Speck because she said that he would rape her multiple times at knife point, and he would demand sex from Shirley around 4 to 5 times every single day, and if he did not get this, he would become very physically and verbally abusive. Now, Speck's probation officer, he once said, when Speck is drunk, he will fight or threaten anyone, as long as he has a knife or gun. When he is sober and unarmed, he couldn't face down a mouse. So what does that tell you? He's just like this big bully when he has a weapon, but when he's sober and unarmed, he's a big wet wipe. Now, the same month that Shirley had filed from divorce, Speck had got in a bar fight with a man when, of course, he was drunk, and he stabbed this man with a knife right? And he got charged with aggravated assault, which I still don't think is enough. I think it should have been attempted murder, but just my opinion. And his lawyer was able to get the charges reduced to disturbing the peace. Like, this man must be a very good lawyer, or he wears really nice aftershave, because how the hell did he get a basic attempted murder to disturbing the peace? This man is wounded. And to make matters even worse and just so ridiculous, he was given a $10 fine for stabbing this man, a $10 fine, and then he did wind up with a 3-day jail sentence because he refused to pay the $10 fine. Where's the justice? I'm not seeing it. And then on March the 5th, 1966, Speck had bought like a 12-year-old car, and he used this car to go and rob a grocery store. So he stole 70 cartons of cigarettes, and his business plan was to sell these out of the boot of his car, or the trunk of his car, might be better known to you. But yeah, so he was going to sell these out the boot of his car. Now, what he didn't think about was the fact that police would be able to track this purchase back to Speck and realise that he was in fact the criminal who robbed the store. Now, they did find his car, but it was abandoned. And then on March the 9th, his sister Carolyn had dropped him off at the Dallas bus depot, and he took a bus to Chicago. Now, once Speck got back to Illinois, he wound up living with his sister Martha Thornton for a few days, and then he went away and got a job sanding plasterboard. And this job would be back in Monmouth. Now, on April 3rd, 1966, 65-year-old Mrs. Virgil Harris had returned home after babysitting, and she returned home around 1 a.m. Now, as she walked into her house, she was horrified to see a burglar holding a knife. Now, she described this man as being around 6 foot. He was white, he was very friendly, polite and softly spoken with a slight southern drawl. This horrific man blindfolded her, tied her up, raped her, ransacked her entire house and stole $2.50 that she had made that evening from babysitting. Like, this man's a monster. A complete and utter monster. A 65-year-old woman, a vulnerable woman. You blindfold her, tie her up, rape her, ransack her house and steal her money. What? And then on the 13th of April 1966, the body of 32-year-old barmaid Mary Catherine Pierce would be found in an empty hog house behind the tavern that she worked in. Now, this tavern was called Frank's Place. Mary, she had last been seen leaving the tavern on the 9th of April around 12 a.m, so presumably after her shift had finished. And it was concluded that she had died from a blow to the abdomen, which wound up rupturing her liver. Now, I'm sure you can guess before I even say it, but it turns out that Richard Speck, he was someone who frequented Frank's Place on the regular. So naturally, the police want to question anyone who is a regular attendee of that tavern. However, when the police show up on April the 19th to question Speck, turns out he's skipped town. He's left, vanished, disappeared into the middle of the night. Don't know where he is. Now, a search of Speck's room would turn up a radio and also some costume jewellery that belonged to Mrs. Virgil Harris. She had reported these as stolen after her attack, and they also found other items that were reported missing from other burglaries in the area. So of course, Speck goes running back to his sister Martha's house, and she was living there with her husband Jean and their 2 teenage daughters. Martha, she worked in paediatrics, and Jean had worked nights as a railroad switchman. Now, Speck had told Martha and Jean that he had to leave Monmouth because he refused to sell narcotics for a crime syndicate. And they were shocked, like, oh my god, are you okay? How did you get involved in that? Are they after you? Asking all the questions. Now, Martha's husband Jean, he had previously served in the US Navy, and he thought to himself, do you know what, there's probably good scope for suitable employment in there for Speck with the US Merchant Marine. And funnily enough, Speck got work pretty much immediately. So he was joining a 33-member crew of Inland Steel's Clarence B. Randall. His voyage, however, would be cut short because he was struck with appendicitis. So he was required to go in for emergency surgery and then obviously take time to recuperate. On May the 20th, he was able to rejoin his crew. However, that rejoinment and, reuniting with friends would be cut short. On June the 14th, he was put ashore because he got into a quarrel. Yes, his temper couldn't hold it. And then on June the 27th, he obviously returned to live with his sister. On June the 30th, Jean had driven Speck to the NMU hiring hall. This was so he could apply to get his seaman's card. Seaman. Now, this hiring hall was 1 block east of 5 attached 2-storey houses. Now, 3 of the 5 houses, they actually contained senior nursing students and also Filipino exchange nurses. The senior nurses and the exchange nurses, they worked for the South Chicago Hospital. 8 of these nurses lived in Easternmost Townhouse, and this was only 150 feet from the NMU hiring hall. Now, on July the 12th, Speck had received an assignment, right? So he sets off to the ship to complete this assignment, and when he gets there, he realises that his assignment has actually been given away to someone else with more experience, more seniority than himself. Now, this enraged Speck. Like, what do you mean you've given it to someone who has more knowledge than me? Like, I am entitled. Give me my job back. So he was absolutely furious, and the only way Speck knows how to channel his rage is through drinking and committing crimes. So Speck decided what he's going to do is go on a drinking spree around the neighbourhood. While Speck is on this drinking binge, he actually meets a woman. She is 53-year-old Ella Mae Hooper. This woman had been spending the day drinking in the same tavern that Speck was, and they got to talking at some point. As we know, Speck is one of Satan's spawns, and he decides to hold Ella Mae at knife point. He forces Ella Mae up to his room, where he proceeds to rape her and also steal her .22 caliber pistol from her. Now, devastatingly at this point, things can only get worse. I mean, Speck is now armed with a gun and completely filled with rage. He decides to set out on the streets of the south side of Chicago. So Speck walks around for about a mile when he comes across one of the dormitories that is housing 9 student nurses from the South Chicago Hospital. And it was at this point where the most devastating and horrific crimes would occur. It was on the 13th of July 1966 when Speck would break into this dormitory, and he broke in through one of the windows of the house and proceeded to make his way to the bedroom. So first off, he knocked on the door of the Filipina exchange student nurse, and this was Corazon Amaral. Now, Corazon was only 23 years old, and she would be held at gunpoint by Speck. Then what Speck proceeded to do is herd Amaral and her fellow exchange students, Merlita Gargulo, who was only 23 years old, and Valentina Pasion, who was only 23 years old. So what he does is he herds the Filipina exchange students into the next room, which actually had the American students. So first we have Patricia Matusik, who was only 20 years old, Pamela Wilkinen, who was also 20, and Nina Jo Schmale, who was 24 years old. These young women were all asleep when Speck entered the bedroom with their 3 terrified friends. Now, Speck abruptly woke up these sleeping girls, and as soon as he had woken them up, he proceeds to tie all 6 girls' wrists behind their back with strips of torn bed sheets that he had tried to make makeshift rope out of. Now, devastatingly, there would only be one survivor from this night of horrific attacks, and that was Corazon Amaral. Now, Amaral had later said, "The American girls told us we more or less had to trust him. Maybe if we are calm and quiet, he will be too. He has been talking to us all and seems calm enough, and that is a good sign." However, this would just not be the case for any of these young women, as Speck would lead them out the room one by one, where he would proceed to strangle or stab these women to death. Amaral later said that her friends, when they were being led out of that room, none of them screamed. However, once he committed the acts that he would commit, she could hear their muffled cries. Now, Amaral sees a moment, an opportunity, and it's only going to be a split second where his back is turned. So what she does is she rolls underneath one of the beds and hides out there, hoping that Speck won't notice that she's gone. Speck wouldn't actually notice that Amaral had disappeared because, tragically, more victims would enter this dormitory. Now, in the midst of this horrific chaos, 2 more student nurses arrive home. So first we have Suzanne Farris, who was only 21 years old. She was the first one to enter the dorm. As she was upstairs, walking along the hallway, just about to approach her bedroom, Speck jumped out, attacked her and stabbed her to death. And devastatingly, Mary Ann Jordan, who was 20 years old, she arrives home to the dorm next, and Speck attacks and stabs her to death as soon as she enters the dorm. Now, later that same evening, 22-year-old Gloria Jean Davey would arrive home late after her boyfriend had dropped her home. And once she entered this dorm, she would face a horrific attack. Before being strangled to death, Gloria was raped and sexually brutalised by Speck. And she was the only one of the girls to, face this kind of attack. The rest had been strangled or stabbed, but none of them had been sexually brutalised in the way that Gloria had. Now, the late arrivals of some of these young women had thrown Speck off of his victim count, I suppose, because he did not realise that Amaral had disappeared. And I guess because he was drunk as well, he was probably less coherent and couldn't even remember how many girls were there to begin with. Now, Amaral, she had hid underneath that bed until 6 a.m. because she wanted to be sure that she would not be attacked by Speck when she came out. And I honestly just don't know how she held it together under that bed. Like, hearing all of that happen to your friends, you have to be so strong and brave. Now, once Amaral had climbed out from underneath the bed, she ran over to a window and she let out a scream. "They are all dead. My friends are all dead. Oh God, I'm the only one alive." And Amaral would continue to scream at the top of her lungs until police arrived. Now, luckily, when police arrive, they obviously secure the scene and they are able to get some fingerprints. Now, when they run these fingerprints, it leads them to none other than Richard Speck. They know immediately who their killer is. Now, just 2 days after the murder, a drifter by the name of Claude Lunsford, he identified Speck. Now, him, Speck and another man had been drinking on the fire escape of the Star Hotel on July the 15th. On July 16th, Lunsford had recognised a sketch of the murderer in the newspaper. Now, he phoned the police around 9:30 p.m. However, the police did not respond to this call. And they could not deny that this call had been received because it was in their call records that this call had come through regarding Speck and it was not acted upon. What the hell? Now, Speck went on to attempt suicide at the Star Hotel. However, the desk clerk, they had obviously called for help. On July 17th, Speck was taken to the hospital and Dr. Leroy Smith immediately recognised him from his tattoo on his arm. Born to raise hell. That had been listed as like a significant thing to look out for, and Dr. Leroy Smith did just this. At this point, the police are called and Speck is finally arrested. Now, the judge had requested an impartial panel to basically deem the competence of Speck to stand trial and also determine whether or not he was sane at the time of the murders. Now, this panel concluded that Speck was in fact competent to stand trial and would have been sane at the time he committed the murders. Now, at this point, Speck claims that he has no recollection of the murders whatsoever. Patricia's back, people. It was Patricia. He said it, no me. However, what Speck didn't realise is he had actually confessed to the murders to Dr. Leroy Smith. Now, what's really annoying is Dr. Smith, he could not testify because when Speck had actually confessed to these murders, he was under sedation, so it wouldn't really stand. However, a Cook County State Attorney, he said, "We didn't need it. We had an eyewitness." Now, Speck's jury trial would begin on April the 3rd, 1967, and this would be in Peoria, Illinois. Now, this was 3 hours southwest of Chicago and had a gag order on the press. Now, Corazon Amaral, she would be the eyewitness in this case, and she would positively identify Speck in the courtroom. When she was asked if she could identify the killer, she stood up out of her seat in the witness box, walked over in front of Speck, pointed in his face so close that she was nearly touching him, and said, "This is the man." In addition to Corazon Amaral's testimony, it was also confirmed by a lieutenant that the fingerprints that were found were an exact match to Richard Speck. Now, on April the 15th, after just 49 minutes of deliberation, the jury concluded that he was guilty and should face the death penalty. My kind of people. On June the 5th, Judge Herbert J. Passion, he sentenced Speck to die in the electric chair, but he granted an immediate stay of execution pending automatic appeal. Now, the Illinois Supreme Court, they actually upheld his conviction, including the death penalty. And this is where I'm going to get just a little bit annoyed, okay, but it does make sense, but it still annoys me. On June the 28th, 1971, the US Supreme Court did uphold Speck's conviction, but they reversed his death sentence. More than 250 potential jurors had been excluded from his jury due to their conscientious or religious beliefs against capital punishment. Now, the case was remanded back to Illinois Supreme Court for resentencing, and it's so annoying. Like, I get why it had to happen, but they've obviously looked for jurors who feel a certain way about capital punishment, and they knew if they had taken on some of those jurors that there would be a chance that the death sentence wouldn't have been given. On November the 21st, 1972, Judge Richard Fitzgerald, he had resentenced Speck. Now, this resentencing was 400 to 1,200 years in prison. This was 8 consecutive life sentences. This was then reduced to 100 to 300 years in prison. Why? Now, Speck did apply for parole, and this was denied within 7 minutes. Now, I'm just going to read this on the page because there's a couple of dates in here, but the first parole hearing was September 1976, which was denied in 7 minutes, and he was denied again in 1977, 78, 81, 84, 87, and 1990. Like, just face facts. You ain't getting out. Now, throughout Speck's time in prison, he was definitely not a model prisoner, that's for sure. He would regularly be caught with drugs and moonshine in his cell. He was called the Birdman because 2 sparrows one day had flew into his cell and he just kept them like his pets. God bless those little birds. I hope they were okay. But the most disturbing thing to come from Speck's time in prison would be a video that resurfaced of him from 1988. This video would be released in 1996 and it is just like batshit crazy. So in this video, Speck's wearing like silky panties. Yeah, meow. And he is also grown women's breasts because he was using smuggled in hormone treatments and he literally had boobs. Now in this video he performs oral sex on another inmate whilst wearing the little silk drawers, and they're doing like a ton of cocaine. However, at one point the cameraman, do we call him a cameraman if he's just another prisoner? But he is the cameraman, he's behind the camera, right? He asks Speck, "Why did you kill those 8 nurses?" Speck then replied saying, "It just wasn't their night." And then he laughed, which honestly makes my blood run cold. Like, what a disgusting, horrific human being he is. Like, look at the state of you, sir. Now, on December the 5th, 1991, the eve of his 50th birthday, Richard Speck would die of a heart attack. Thank God. Thank God he died. Like, it should have been sooner, but, you know, I'll take it. However, I do wish there was an element of torture in there. Hate that it was a heart attack. I feel like he got off very easy, but at least he's gone. And of course, I do just want to take a moment to remember the women who sadly lost their lives to Richard Speck. Now, we do speak about the 8 nurses who lost their lives that very night, but we do need to remember that he had victims before this. Even outside of the other victims that he murdered, his own wife was a victim of him as well. But of course, for those women who did lose their lives to Speck, I just want to take a moment and say that I hope their family and I hope them themselves have been able to get some peace, and the family hopefully got some closure when he was sentenced. Although I can only imagine how horrific it would be to see his death sentence be reversed, because he showed those women no mercy whatsoever. These young women had aspirations. I mean, you know, the ones who we spoke about at the end, they were student nurses. They were people who wanted to make a positive difference in this world. And then someone like Speck, who's just a complete monster, took that opportunity away from them. And it's just so horrific that, you know, some of the nicest people in the world are targeted by such monsters. It genuinely breaks my heart, and I will never, ever understand it. But that is it for today's True Crime and Makeup episode. Thank you so much for watching and being so supportive all the time. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you have enjoyed this video. If you enjoy True Crime and Makeup, definitely subscribe, because I post every single Wednesday and Sunday at 7:30 British Standard Time. If you have watched the video and enjoyed, please just make sure that you engage in the video in some way. Because I still continue to use words that YouTube doesn't like, they kind of block me from the algorithm. So anything that can push my videos out would really mean the world, especially a comment or a share. That really seems to help. Down in the description you will find a link to all of the products that I've used on my face today. They're not affiliate links, but I just put them there because it makes it easier for you guys if you want to get anything. Down below you will also find my Instagram and my TikTok. I post a lot on Instagram, so make sure you give me a follow there. You'll also find my email address where you can send your case suggestions, or you can just leave them in the comments below and I'll add them to the growing list that I've got. Also, just want to say, I know I've got a lot of emails through from you guys too, and I am working through them gradually. I've been busy recently, so I feel like I'm kind of slacking on my replies, but I will be getting back to all of them in the next couple of days. But I hope you enjoyed this one. Stay safe, be a good person, don't be a bad person, look after each other, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!